Week on Biography. Tonight, George Carlin.
Thinking?
This funny man always pushes the envelope, but never plays the fool. George Carlin has an uncanny ability to maintain a cutting-edge hipness even in his 60s. Just last year, when told he would receive a Lifetime Achievement tribute at the American Comedy Awards, he said that he would accept the honor only on the condition that I at least be able to live out the rest of my life.
What's happening? Alice Lee here, you hippy-dippy weatherman with all the hippy-dippy weather.
He started off as a mainstream comedian in skinny ties and short hair. He became the counterculture comic of a generation. For over 40 years, George Carlin has been questioning our most sacred beliefs.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky.
And observing our smallest habits.
That's all your house is? It's a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff.
George was the first rock star type comedian. He attracted huge crowds in huge venues, and he still can.
He was like this warrior to me, this guy who went out in the world and was shaking things up.
In prisons, before they give you a lethal injection, they swab your arm with alcohol.
He adores words. He adores the way words go together.
Carlin has made a career out of words, including 7 you can never say on television.
Suck it, mother, and
In September of 1969, George Carlin is booed off a Las Vegas stage by an audience incensed over his profanity and politics. He is 32 and at a crossroads. Gambling his career on a new image, he is about to change comedy forever.
Ladies and gentlemen, George Carlin.
New York City, 1936. There was nothing funny about the Depression, but in the Upper West Side apartment of Mary and Patrick Carlin, there was often laughter. He was a successful advertising salesman with a gift for funny stories. She was a stylish mother raising their 5-year-old son, Patrick Jr. Both were second-generation Irish Americans with deep roots in the Catholic Church. When there were problems, they came from a bottle.
I think Dad had a habit of turning up with at least a bottle of whiskey in him, singing the Rose of Tralee, and expecting things to just be hunky-dory, you know. And Mom got pretty sick of that.
Mary and Patrick's marriage was headed for divorce, but in a moment of reconciliation, she became pregnant, and on May 12, 1937, George Carlin was born. His parents named him after Mary's talented but crazy brother, George Beery, who was sent to a mental hospital after he took off all his clothes on a crosstown trolley.
At dinner one Thanksgiving, he leaned over to me and he said, I'm an admiral. Told me he was an admiral. And I was impressed. Not that he was an admiral, but that he was nuts.
As for his father, George never got to know him. 2 months after George's birth, Mary Carlin left her husband when his drinking became intolerable. She and her boys moved into a small apartment in Morningside Heights, not far from Harlem. Here, George met the collection of Irish, black, and Puerto Rican neighbors who would one day become part of his act.
We had your West Side kind of Irish-American guys. You know, these were the older guys. These were the guys that had been in Depression, been in your war. I was in your war. Archie Bunker now is, I guess, the most famous of those. Gleason did one. There's been a lot of this guy around. And then the guys younger than him, hey, they're kids, third generation, talk like that, you know. Those are the Irish guys I grew up with, you know. A lot of guys got on the force, you know. All the policemen in New York, of course, have that voice. Come on, get on at the corner here, will you?
I think the neighborhood gave him supreme self-confidence. Our neighborhood was definitely cool, and still is. It outfitted you for the world.
George attended Corpus Christi, the progressive Catholic school down the street where the nuns encouraged the students to think for themselves. This suited young George just fine, because he decided early on that the church was not for him.
Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
I rejected the church thing very early. First communion, they said I was gonna feel different with the host in my mouth. I didn't. And I thought, wow, I better watch what these people tell me.
The Texaco Star Theft.
Throughout his childhood, George was often home alone because his mother had gone back to work as an executive secretary and his older brother was away at boarding school. George loved music, especially jazz, and the R&B sounds coming from neighboring Harlem. But it was the radio comedians who kept him company, especially the sophisticated humor of Fred Allen. At the movies, George liked the verbal antics of comic actor Danny Kaye. Like Kaye, George was curious about words and often asked his mother what they meant.
His love of words, his savoring of words, his seeing through euphemism, I think made an impression on at an early age, because she was always saying, he'd ask a word, she'd say, well, let's go look it up.
By age 5, Carlin had shown distinctive signs of showbiz talent. At age 10, he told his mother he was going to be an announcer, a DJ, a comedian, and an actor. But when it came to school, George was a poor student. He had an innate distaste for institutional learning, preferring instead the role of class clown.
I found there were 2 times when I was tempted to clown around in class. One was when the work was real easy, you know, and you were bored. And the other is when the work was real hard and you were bored, you know. And you feel, well, why not deprive someone else of their education?
George was always, I believe, looking through things, looking past the surface to the basis, even as a young kid. So if you put on an air or you were a little sanctimonious or a little pompous, George would get, I mean, George would just lampoon that.
When George graduated 8th grade, his mother bought him a tape recorder. With it, he'd spend hours recording fake commercials and radio broadcasts.
This is George Carlin in the Waldorf Astoria lobby. We're having a banquet for William Randolph Hearst Jr., and there's a lot of celebrities here from the press, from radio, television, stage, screen, and everything.
George's energies, however, were not confined to tape recorders and radio programs. By junior high, he was a regular delinquent, stealing money out of student lockers and smoking marijuana long before it was fashionable. In desperation, his frantic mother shipped him off to a reformatory run by Catholic brothers.
She sent my brother to boarding school. She sent me to camp. She couldn't, you know, in a way, she couldn't kind of wait to, you know, get you with male supervision. That was her big thing. No, yeah, boy has no male supervision at home. Like, that's going to help, you know.
And he gets up there and he takes one of these art gum erasers and he breaks it up and he colors it these different colors and puts it in like a little plastic thing and tries to sell it to some other kid as heroin. So they quickly kicked him out. Or didn't kick him out that quick, but they said, would you please take him back to where he came from? So the 8th grade nuns, they said, well, we'll take him back, but only if he writes the school play. Is that beautiful? And he did write the school play, and it was good.
Though the nuns recognized George's talent, Mary Carlin had no intention of letting her son go into show business. She had elitist ambitions and wanted him to become a refined, well-dressed businessman working one day on Madison Avenue.
My mother was kind of funny. She wanted real gentility, and it just wasn't there.
I think her dream for him was to have become a nice, sober, successful version of her husband. That would have been exactly the way she saw George.
But George had other ideas. At 16, to his mother's dismay, he dropped out of school and at 17 enlisted in the Air Force. He planned to marry his high school sweetheart and support them on an airman's salary. When the engagement fell through, he was already in the service, trained as a radar mechanic on B-47 bombers. He told himself it was just a job until he could start his real career in broadcasting. That came sooner than he imagined, when in 1956, the Air Force allowed him to accept a part-time gig off base, spinning records at the #1 radio station in Shreveport, Louisiana.
It's George Carlin is on the air, the smoothest record man anywhere.
Okay then, Solid, how you doing? Lots of music coming up for you between now and 5:45. Got the brand new Everly Brothers record, and we'll be playing both sides of it for you. Stick around. Good things happening here on 1480 at Carlin's Corner.
For George, the job at KJO was a perfect arrangement until one day he went a song too far. In honor of a nervous commanding officer nicknamed Shaky, he played the Elvis Presley song All Shook Up. For the Air Force brass, it was the final infraction on a long list of infractions, and George was asked to leave the service.
This action is a result of the following: failing to repair for guard duty at Building 34 on the 14th of June, driving while intoxicated at 0030 hours, 17th of Feb, disrespect to air policemen, failure to obey a lawful order by an air policeman, and disobeying a direct order from an officer, June 24th. That was a good June I had.
Discharged at 20, George got a radio job in Boston, where he was soon fired for borrowing the news van to make a marijuana run to New York. A year later, in 1959, he was a DJ in Fort Worth, Texas, dreaming of better prospects, when Jack Burns, an announcer friend from Boston, arrived unannounced. Jack and George shared a similar sense of humor and decided to partner up as a comedy act called Burns and Carlin.
They started doing very strange routines, the very late 50s, the early 60s, and that was the era of the truly sick joke.
Listen, could you tell me, Killer, how your fabulous boxing career started?
My old man says, kid, you got a good right hand. Plus, we didn't have a lot of money at that time. We had to keep my mother on as a sparring partner. That didn't work out too good, though. She kept falling out of the wheelchair.
Oh, yes.
For a couple of budding comedians, Fort Worth held limited horizons. So in February 1960, Burns and Carlin climbed into George's Dodge Dart Pioneer and headed west to Hollywood. They had $300 between them. Like prospectors, they were out to seek their fortune, not in gold, but in laughs. You are watching George Carlin, part of Bold Week on Biography. In February 1960, Eisenhower was in the White House. Rock and roll was on the radio. And 23-year-old George Carlin was in Los Angeles with his comedy partner, Jack Burns. Immediately, they found work on a local radio station as a drive-time duo called the Wright Brothers. At night, they performed under their own names at local clubs and even recorded an album at a small label. They were considered a couple of hipsters whose jokes were topical and offbeat, but rarely offensive. A favorite was their spoof of advertising, as seen in this 1961 appearance on Playboy's Penthouse series.
Cigarette? Love to have one. And say, my brand, Wings. Appreciate that. Oopsie, Daisy. Oh, boy. Why, George, you bent over and picked that up like a 16-year-old boy. Well, no wonder. With my Playtex Living jockey shorts.
Jack and George had grown up on the comedians of the 40s and early 50s, but now it was the 60s, and a new, more irreverent sense of comedy, dubbed boomer humor, had arrived.
Historically, boomer humor has its roots in the 50s. 50s of dissent against the arms race, against conformity, against suburban sprawl, and against the organization, the corporate organization, the governmental organization, the militarist organization. And there were two very powerful personalities at that time. One was Lenny Bruce, who was kind of the gut of the movement, and there was Mort Sahl, who was kind of the head of the movement, the intellect of it.
One night, Mort Sahl and Lenny Bruce caught Burns and Carlin's act and offered to help them get an agent. For a couple of comedy newcomers, it was tantamount to divine intervention.
I think George learnt an enormous amount from Lenny. In fact, Lenny is reputed to have said that he saw something of himself in George.
Soon George and Jack were performing in nightclubs around the country. In August of 1960, they were appearing in Dayton, Ohio, when George met a beautiful 21-year-old hostess named Brenda Hosbrook, who seemed hipper than her small-town roots.
I said to her, what does a guy do here in Dayton after the show and everything? And she said something like, well, if he finds a girl who's got her own apartment and a stereo, he can take her to breakfast and take her home. I said, oh, yeah, well, you sure?
They were just immediately in love and straight into bed, and, you know, for the rest of the gig, that was it. They didn't part company. I think Brenda was a terrific sounding board for George. She was very important to him in making him realize just how funny he could be and how independent he could be.
A year after they met, George and Brenda were married, but George's mother was not about to let her son get away so easily and showed up in Miami where he and Brenda were honeymooning. Mary Carlin had often been dismissive of her son's chosen career, but now she liked being the mother of a budding star, reflected in the glow of his newfound fame. But the relationship George was really tired of was his partnership with Jack Burns. Both men had always considered the arrangement temporary, so in March of 1962, they split up. 3 months later, George made his solo TV debut on The Tonight Show and on TV's Talent Scouts with an act that included an impression of President Kennedy.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Attorney General, to Joint Chiefs of Staff, to members of the Supreme Court, and the rest of my family.
The TV appearances did little for George's career, and he returned to the nightclub circuit. At 25, he was a working comedian, though a struggling one, earning a meager $11,000 a year before expenses. For 2 years, he and Brenda lived out of his car in between stays at her parents' home in Dayton and his mother's in New York. But then, to their surprise, Brenda became pregnant, and in June 1963 gave birth to a daughter they named Kelly. George's life on the road was hardly ideal for raising a family.
I guess I spent the first year of my life in the back of a Dodge Dart. And my dad was making about 8, 9, 10, 12 bucks a night, you know, sometimes with only 1 or 2 people in the audience.
In 1964, George moved the family to New York, where TV agents might catch his act. He took a small apartment in his mother's building and hit the clubs and coffee houses in Greenwich Village.
Some nights I got $5, some nights I got $10, some nights you got only a hamburger. So it was a tough 2 years, but I learned a lot, and eventually the Merv Griffin people came in. And I had this one polished piece. Well, I had more than one, but I had one that was my A piece, The Indian Sergeant.
A lot of you have been asking me about the promotion list. You'd like to make brave second class. Get another scar up on your arm. Well, I'm happy to say the results of your early tests have come through. You're doing beautifully. Burning settlers' homes, everybody passed. Imitating a coyote, everybody passed. Sneaking quietly through the woods, everybody passed, except limping ox.
The Indian Sergeant led to dozens of TV appearances. Suddenly, George was a mainstream success, recognized around the country where he still performed regularly. But George was not content to just be a comic. In 1966, he moved his family to Los Angeles to pursue an old ambition, acting.
When I had these dreams about being like Danny Kaye, I kept them in my heart and mind as to what I wanted to do. I'll be a disc jockey, I'll be a comedian, and then they'll have to let me be an actor. That was the way I used to say it as a kid. They'll have to let me. If I'm a good comedian, they have to let me be an actor.
But the acting roles came slowly. Finally, in 1966, he was cast as Marlo Thomas's agent in an episode of That Girl, and 2 years later as car hop Herbie Fleck in the comedy film With 6 You Get Egg Roll. By his own admission, George had a lot to learn about acting.
By now, Jack Lemmon is my model, and I think I'm going to be a comic actor. And I just ran into a wall. See, I thought acting was my birthright. Well, I can do that. I can do this. I can do that. What is it? You just, you go out, you do it. Well, I couldn't do it. Too many things to remember. Had no training, had no technique to fall back on. I was just raw.
His dream thwarted, George returned full-time to performing at mainstream clubs. The money was good, but by the end of the 1960s, he was facing an identity crisis. America was in the midst of a political and social rebellion, while he remained on the sidelines.
So I was kind of lost, and I hung out with a few rock musicians. And their hair got longer, and their clothing changed, and their message changed, their songs changed. And we were all pot smokers, and a little bit of acid occasionally. And that part of me began to get fed.
In the summer of 1969, George ran headlong into the cultural divide when he appeared on stage at the Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. He was 32, earning $12,500 a week and playing to a conservative audience, the type his mother had always wanted him to be, a type he didn't respect.
He said, I can't anymore, be a traitor to my generation. I can't make the parents of my friends laugh when the parents of my friends are sending my friends to war.
And here I was entertaining the enemy, so to speak, because my mind and my heart was with the youth culture and their beliefs. And it began to be uncomfortable in these clubs, and there began to be a feeling of, I don't belong in these places, what am I doing? So that two-level thing, the nice mainstream guy and the malcontent were at odds, and the malcontent was beginning to win.
George's rebellion took the form of a few choice words during a routine about marijuana.
He said, I don't say on stage, but I do smoke a little every now and then.
The audience was shocked, and when George added some derogatory remarks about America's war in Vietnam, a shouting match ensued.
And now I'm getting some heat, a little bit of flack from them. So I start giving some things back. I don't remember any of the exchanges, but I know I called them. I said, you people, you businessmen, you golfing, whatever I did, some combination of things like that.
The outburst put George's career in jeopardy. He could toe the nightclub line and keep his $12,000 a week contract, or he could risk everything and follow his conscience. In the end, he decided it was time to change his act.
George Carlin, here!
A new, more controversial George Carlin was about to emerge.
Did you know that George Carlin believes there's therapeutic value in humor? He says laughter reveals a lot about you. It's like voting.
In 1970, George Carlin found himself at a crossroads. He was 33 and had just been fired from some of the top clubs in the country for using profanity. Following the outburst, he had decided on a new career path, one that included long hair and blue jeans.
That was a major change in George's life, and an admirable one. He became truly of his generation instead of playing the fool for the other generation.
The word was either one of two things. Either he's going in a nice new direction, or he flipped out. He flipped. He's crazy. He's doing all this hippie stuff there. He's got tie-dye T-shirt. He's throwing away a beautiful career.
Carlin's mother, Mary, was one of those who had thought he'd flipped out. Even at the best of times, the 65-year-old woman had rarely given her son the unqualified acceptance he had wanted.
And here's the deal on my mother. All during these nice years, when my hair was short and I wore a suit and tie, she was fine. Star's mother, or budding Star's mother. Then I go this other way, with, as she would put it, the dirty hair, the dirty hippies. And she would wish for me to be back in the tuxedo. Cut that dirty, why don't you get rid of the dirty beard?
George ignored his mother, and with his wife Brenda's help, started booking alternative venues like coffee houses and colleges. In early 1970, he appeared at an obscure little New York City club called The Focus that catered to urban hippies. He was on the verge of a contract with Little David Records, Flip Wilson's label, and needed to convince the executives that his new image had a following.
What walked through that door looked like
all the people who were sitting in the audience, but to an extreme. But it certainly wasn't George Carlin.
Carlin began the set with a poem about his hair, meant to calm the fears of his older fans, while sending a message to a potential younger audience.
I'm aware some stare at my hair. In fact, to be fair, some really despair of my hair. But I don't care, because they're not aware, nor are they debonair. In fact, they're just square. They see hair down to there, say beware, and go off on a tear. I say no fair.
They went crazy. They loved it. They loved it. I mean, part of it was due to the fact that, hey, this is for us. This is now he's on our side.
But the record people needed reassurance and contacted the Bitter End, a larger and hipper venue in Greenwich Village.
I got a call from Jeff Wald, who was his manager at the time, and said, would I play George Carlin? And my immediate answer was no.
The hipsters who booked those clubs saw George as a Vegas comic. So it took some arm twisting and pulling and whatever to get him in there, but they'll take a chance. You know, what do they got to lose? They're going to fill some seats with it.
In June of 1971, George stepped onto the stage at the Bitter End and began his set. The material served as a bridge between the old Carlin.
It's 8 o'clock in Los Angeles. It's 9 o'clock in Denver. It's 10 o'clock in Chicago.
In Baltimore, it's 6:42. Time for the 11 o'clock report.
And the new.
We have all these drugs available to us. You know, that's why there's a drug problem, man. There's all those drug stores, right? Every 3 or 4 blocks, there's a big sign. Drugs. Open all night. Drugs. We deliver. Drugs. Cut rate. Drugs. It's the biggest thing on their sign. Cosmetics, sundries, drugs. And the pharmacist is always stoned. You ever notice that? Check his eyes. He's experimenting with something there. How come he can never fill a prescription right away, you know? Really, he always gives you that, better come back in about an hour. I can't even read the bastard, you know?
I said, this guy is fabulous. I mean, this guy was funny. This guy was funny.
2 weeks later, George recorded the album FM and AM for Little David Records. Released in January 1972, the album went gold and earned a Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album. George's risky decision that night in 1969 at the Frontier Hotel had paid off, both creatively and financially. Only his mother, Mary, remained skeptical. It took a performance at Carnegie Hall in the summer of 1972 to show her that all kinds of people, not just hippies, liked his act.
I noticed backstage she was kind of white. She was kind of ashen, because I think it was dawning on her that this really tough, irreverent thing was okay in a lot of people's eyes.
But many people still objected to Carlin's profanity, and when he used it 3 weeks later during a performance in Milwaukee, he was arrested. To many observers, Carlin had picked up the mantle of the late Lenny Bruce and was becoming the counterculture comic for the next generation. On his follow-up album, he confirmed those opinions. Class Clown began by chronicling his childhood in Morningside Heights. It also poked fun at his Catholic upbringing while thanking some of the nuns and priests who had encouraged him. But the album's real centerpiece was a routine called 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television.
I love the 7 words because it's just so frontal. It's just right there. Here it is. Can't do them. They must be real bad words.
Well, we have more ways to describe dirty words than we actually have dirty words. That seems a little strange to me. It seems to indicate that somebody was awfully interested in these words. They kept referring to them. They called them bad, saucy, raunchy, rude, crude, lewd, lascivious, indecent, profane, obscene, blue, off-color, risque, suggestive, cursing, cussing, swearing, and all I could think of were
Carlin created the now famous 7 words to make a point about censorship, that it's not the words that are inherently bad, but the fears and superstitions surrounding them. To Carlin's delight, the routine instigated an historic challenge by the Federal Communications Commission when New York radio station WBAI broadcast a recording of it on October 30th, 1973.
There was this organization called Morality in Media, and one of its board members, a man named Douglas, was driving around in a car with his son and heard this. And apparently he had been monitoring WBAI, so they made the complaint to the FCC. And the FCC found these words to be indecent.
The FCC challenge would go all the way to the Supreme Court, where it would become known as the Carlin case. In a 5-4 decision, the justices would side with the FCC, and the 7 words would remain taboo. By the end of 1973, however, words were not George's problem. Cocaine was. Marijuana had been a staple since his teens, but now he was appearing on stage coked up. If he continued the habit at the rate he was going, he would end up like his hero Lenny Bruce, dead.
Biography's look at George Carlin will continue. But first, do you know tonight's bio trivia? In what unlikely drama did George Carlin appear alongside Barbra Streisand? Visit biography.com for the answer.
George Carlin had traded in one image for another, and at 36, he had firmly established himself as a counterculture comic with a mainstream appeal. But with the success had come a cocaine habit that kept Carlin wired for days.
My dad would be missing. He would leave for 5 days and not tell us where he'd go, and he'd be off with Hell's Angels or somebody partying or God knows where. We couldn't find him anywhere.
While Carlin had turned to drugs to help him cope with his newfound fame, his wife Brenda had turned to alcohol. For years she had lived in her husband's shadow, and his absence from her for months at a time had driven her to drink.
There were days when my dad was insane on acid or something, and my mom and I would be taking care of him. But most of the time it was Dad and I getting together and saying, how are we going to get Mom to stop drinking? Or we have to keep the car keys out of Mom's hands.
Added to the volatile mix of drugs and alcohol was George's relationship with his mother. In 1973, Mary Carlin came out to Los Angeles for a short visit and was still there 2 years later. Even as an adult, George still bristled from his mother's criticism.
A couple of years ago, I hadn't seen him with the beard nor the long hair. No, not a word did I know. And he suddenly appeared in my home. And there he stood. I went silent. And when I'm silent, there's trouble. So he realized something was happening. And he said, Mother, don't you remember what you wrote in my autograph when I finished Corpus Christi? I said, yes. He said, what did you say? I said, George, insist on being yourself always, in all ways. He said, Mother, eat your words.
In 1975, the difficult relationship between mother and son came to a head as Brenda's drinking grew worse, exacerbated when Mary became her drinking companion.
She kind of kept handing my mother drinks, and my mother kept taking them. It was a very strange dynamic with Mary around.
Brenda's alcoholism was taking a terrible toll. She was down to 87 pounds and had been arrested twice for drunk driving. The next time the cops put her in handcuffs, it was because she had backed George's car into a hotel lobby. Brenda was near death when she checked into a detox center and began the long road to recovery. George stayed by her, giving her the time and attention she craved. When the day came for Brenda to go home, she gave George an ultimatum, and it had to do with Mary.
She said to my dad, I'm not coming home if she's there. And my dad went home, packed Mary's bags, and said, you're getting on an airplane right now and you're leaving.
It was the final showdown in a lifetime of showdowns, and the relationship would never recover. For nearly 40 years, Carlin had been rebelling against his mother's expectations, and much of it had shaped his comedy. Now, with her departure, he turned from the rebellious and autobiographical humor of the early 70s to more observational routines about everyday life.
In football, the specialist comes in to kick. In baseball, the specialist comes in to relieve someone. In football, you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. Whoops.
By the late 1970s, George Carlin was no longer the hot new comic rattling the establishment's cage. His work seemed tame, and except for the occasional TV appearance, his career and his life were in decline. In 1978, he suffered a mild heart attack, exacerbated, no doubt, by his cocaine habit. He was also facing a giant tax bill and fines from the IRS for failing to make past payments. At 41, George was feeling beat, personally and creatively.
The whole hippie counterculture thing was winding down now, so he had to re-find himself and get started, and he had a pretty big coke habit to get rid of before he could really get moving again.
With Brenda's help, he kicked his cocaine habit and concentrated on writing new material. In 1982, he released his first hit album in 7 years, A Place for My Stuff.
That's all your house is? It's a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. Now, sometimes you've got to move. You got to get a bigger house. Why? Too much stuff.
That same year, George had a second, more serious heart attack and was rushed to a Santa Monica hospital. His father had died of a heart attack at 57, and George feared he was following in the old man's footsteps. But the hospital gave him an experimental enzyme that saved his life, and 2 months later, he was performing on stage at Carnegie Hall. The next time he faced death was in 1984, when his mother died at the age of 89. He reacted to the loss with a mixture of sadness and relief.
When she did die, there was a huge transformation in him. I mean, it was truly like a ton of bricks had been lifted off his shoulders. He was a changed man.
George had lost his first and fiercest critic, but her passing actually freed him. Anger had fueled some of his work since the 70s, but as the country moved into the 90s, he reacted with even greater agitation to the events around him.
The feeling of an era, the tone that Reagan set, it just fed your dissatisfaction. It fed your impatience with things. So it fostered the emergency. It wasn't until 1992, really, that some of these larger issues began to show up in my work.
In 1992, Carlin taped his 8th HBO special, Jammin' in New York. He was 55, and if audiences thought George Carlin was mellowing with age, they were in for a surprise. You are watching George Carlin, part of Bold Week on Biography. By 1994, the 55-year-old George Carlin was making a comeback. Gone were the gentle musings of the long-haired hippie, replaced now by the angry rants of an Old Testament prophet.
I got this real moron thing I do. It's called thinking. And I'm not a very good American because I like to form my own opinions. I don't just roll over when I'm told to. Sad to say, most Americans just roll over on command. Not me. I have certain rules I live by. My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing.
There is a much more of a curmudgeon quality about him as he's gotten older. Although in many ways he's eternally youthful.
Thinking of giving up hope?
Good for you. Hope sucks.
In 1994, George was given his own TV series. The George Carlin Show was about a New York cabbie with an outlook on life not unlike its stars.
That self-indulgent, fat-ass boomer yuppies like you can't keep their hands off the croissants. And now they all need loose-fitting jeans.
It's if George Carlin hadn't become a stand-up comedian, this is what his life would have been like.
Oh, wait a minute. There's still one little problem.
I got no problem. How are you gonna piss off the world now? Guy with my experience, I can do that without a ponytail.
The show was set in a bar, modeled after the one George's father used to frequent. But such personal touches were not enough to make the show a happy experience for Carlin.
The writers would go through the nicety of having him at the meeting with his notes. And eventually they'd tell him, you really don't know about sitcoms or comedy.
I really didn't fit into that corporate comedy world. I was very happy when it was over. I was rooting for not to be picked up.
The show was canceled after one season, and George returned to the arena he knew best. In May of 1997, Carlin's career was in top form, and he felt he was doing his best work. He was looking forward to his 60th birthday and the release of a new comedy book called Brain Droppings. What he was not prepared for was his wife's breast cancer. On Mother's Day, 1997, Brenda Carlin died. For 37 years, she had been George's deepest love and closest confidant, and the one who laughed loudest at his jokes.
He seemed a little lost and definitely depressed. I mean, there was a real loneliness, rambling around this huge house, every corner of which was my mother.
George coped with the loss in the way he knew best, by going back to work, never expecting to fall in love again. In the spring of 1998, George was performing in Las Vegas when he met a young comedy writer named Sally Wade. There was an instant attraction, but George had made a promise to himself not to date for at least a year after Brenda's death. When the year was over, he called Sally. Today, George Carlin spends over 100 days a year performing around the country, including Las Vegas. He does the occasional acting role, and in 1999, he played against type as a Catholic cardinal in the movie Dogma.
Now, we all know how the majority and the media in this country view the Catholic Church. They think of us as a passé, archaic institution. People find the Bible obtuse, even hokey.
It seemed like Cardinal Glick he'd be a natural for, because a lot of his Catholic humor was very irreverent, but also reverential at the same time.
This ceremony's a big mistake.
The Catholic Church does not make mistakes.
Please, what about the Church's silent consent to the slave trade?
And its platform of non-involvement during the Holocaust?
All right. Mistakes were made.
Though Carlin feels his acting has gotten better, his first love remains stand-up. It's his passion and his legacy.
Free admission, free appraisal, free alterations, free delivery, free estimates, free home trial, and free parking. No cash, no problem, no kidding. No fuss, no muss, no risk, no obligation, no red tape, no down payment, no entry fee, no hidden charges, no purchase necessary. No one will call on you. No payments or interest till September.
He really created kind of the modern day stand-up comedian's act. You know, Lenny Bruce kind of blazed a trail and burned out really quick. But George really picked up the ball and ran with it.
Now you got whole generations of persons that have heard him. I mean, I've been to gigs where guys bring their kid and stuff like this, you know. He speaks to the rebel within everyone.
As F. Scott Fitzgerald said, there are no second acts in American life. George has had at least three, and who knows if there's not a fourth coming.
In his own way, he's trying to make the world a better place. And even though he says that he's given up on the world, I know him personally, and he hasn't.
As Carlin's career continues into a new era, he remains an unblinking observer of the human condition. He's following in the tradition of the ancient court jester, risking his neck to say what is true while keeping the king laughing. George Carlin is a founding member of the website Laugh.com, where veteran comics are featured alongside up-and-comers. The site features songs, parodies, celebrity roasts, and, of course, irreverent observations from the twisted visionary himself, George Carlin. Bold Week continues tomorrow on Biography with Susan Sarandon. Whether actress or activist, she has relied on one thing, strength of character. That's Susan Sarandon, Thursday. For Biography, I'm Harry Smith. Thanks for watching.